makes this case unique, in my opinion, and what crosses the red line, is that Dr. used information that he had regarding his patients about the medications they were receiving. He used that information and he went to their homes, at least one that we know of and two that he admitted to, and he stole medication from patients in their homes. That to me is a red line. It's the ultimate breach of trust.
A breach of trust is hard to overcome. This is the second episode covering the topic of impairment. Today, we'll be walking through a case with several factors, including criminal activity and a provider that chose to take advantage of vulnerable patients. I'm glad you're joining me in today's discussion. It's an important one. You're listening to MedBoard Pulse, a podcast by the State Medical Board of Ohio. I'm your host, Jerica Stewart, Chief of Communications. Let's talk, Ohio. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'd encourage you to listen to our last episode, which provides the background on impairment. In that episode, we learned that the board considers impairment to be a licensee's inability to practice because of substance abuse, mental or physical conditions. All deserve attention and require proper treatment. Impairment is a complicated topic because it comes in a variety of packages. One of the greatest difficulties, from a regulatory perspective, is that the stakes are often very high because of the role that healthcare providers play in society. If that wasn't enough, there's often stigma attached to issues of impairment, making it even more difficult to receive timely reports. The case we're looking at today follows a sad series of events. Today's provider was a licensed podiatrist, we'll call him Dr. Z, with a history of impairment. About a decade before the case we're talking about today unfolded, Dr. Z entered into a consent agreement with the board due to an issue of substance abuse. After 5 years, Dr. Z was released from the terms of his consent agreement and able to practice medicine without limitations. But unfortunately, the board became aware of a relapse in 2022 and summarily suspended him when it learned of his scheme to obtain controlled substances by writing prescriptions in the names of patients without their knowledge and attempting to pick them up from the pharmacies in addition to other criminal actions taken that we'll discuss in this episode. It was clear to the board Dr. Z was not in good health. Joining me today is one of our enforcement attorneys, Patrick. How do you pronounce your last name, Patrick?
Haggerty.
Haggerty.
Yes.
I feel like that was a building in the college that I went to, for sure.
There's a business building at Ohio State. It's Haggerty Hall, but it's spelled differently than my name. My name is Heagerty, and that is spelled Hagerty.
I see. So no claim to fame.
No.
So, Patrick, can you please, I could say introduce yourself, but I'm pretty sure you just gave a very thorough introduction. What is your role at the medical board?
So I'm an enforcement attorney. Essentially what I do is gather information and take that information that I gather and come to some form of outcome. That could be anywhere from closing the case to issuing what we call a cite, which is taking formal administrative action against a licensee's license. And then taking that information, if we do cite that licensee, preparing that for taking all that information, putting it in a nice little package, and preparing it for the hearing unit.
Okay. And I know in the past we've talked about the process of receiving complaints and making sure that, they're being triaged and investigating, and then what happens when it goes to enforcement. So hopefully our listeners, are a little bit familiar with that process. Today we're going to be revisiting the topic of impairment and specifically looking at a case. In this case with Dr. Z, which we're going to say, by the way, Dr. Z instead of the name. This is actually a case that you personally worked on. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
So when we pick up this case, Dr. Z had already been disciplined previously by the medical board and in fact was under a consent agreement in the past. They were no longer currently under a consent agreement, which you may remember in the previous episode, Brandy spoke about what that probation process or consent agreements look like. Can you please explain what a consent agreement is, Patrick?
Sure. So to put it in parlance, it's almost like a plea agreement in a criminal case. So there's any number of reasons why a licensee may not want to have a full hearing or settle a case without having to go to full hearing. It could be a financial burden. It could be the stress. It could be family issues. It could be a lot of different things that lead a licensee to enter into consent agreement. What a consent agreement is an agreement between the licensee and the board that the licensee will be subject to some form of sanction, and that sanction could be a reprimand with a fine. It could be a suspension. It could be an indefinite suspension, which means that the licensee is suspended until they actually take steps to reinstate their license. It could be a definite suspension, which could mean that after a certain period of time, it could be days or a year or whatever, the licensee is automatically reinstated. And there's usually a monetary fine, and possibly even taking some sort of, remedial courses in ethics, things like that. So, but in this situation, Dr. Z, that consent agreement was an indefinite suspension, and in order to get his license reinstated, he had to go through a lot of treatment, get two different doctors that are whose specific discipline is addiction treatment to say that he was fit to practice again. And then we did have continuing monitoring for 5 years in that case. And after 5 years, Dr. Z was off probation and was deemed fit to practice without any restrictions.
So they were, as Brandy talked about last time, could have been one of the success stories. You know, he did his time, basically. You know, he was able to complete his probation and was no longer being monitored by the medical board, which is the ideal situation. Sometimes, providers do have concerns or issues, but, if we can rehabilitate them, that's the goal. This is the first case we've looked at since we've been doing the podcast where the board actually issued a summary suspension first as its disciplinary action before it went to hearing. Can you please talk about what that means as well?
So a summary suspension is a fairly drastic situation where the licensee's practice, not only is there a violation of our rules, our board rules and laws, but their continued practice presents an immediate threat to public safety. So when you have an impaired physician, such as this person, they could misdiagnose. They could treat somebody's injury in a way that could cause further injury. But again, you're trying to protect the public, and their continued practice is an immediate threat to public safety. So the board deems they need to be out of practice immediately, but they are entitled to have a very expedited hearing if they so desire.
We'll take a closer look after a brief break.
Every month, the State Medical Board of Ohio meets to discipline providers and vote on policy matters. If you can't attend a meeting or watch it online, there is another way to stay informed. In the weeks following the meeting, the board publishes a monthly formal action list that includes the names of the discipline providers, a summary of the disciplinary actions initiated, and the sanctions imposed by the board during the meeting. To view this list and explore more resources, visit med.ohio.gov.
It's your money, come and claim it. The Ohio Department of Commerce Division of Unclaimed Funds is safeguarding nearly $4 billion in unclaimed funds, so there's a good chance you or someone you know has money waiting to be claimed. Just head over to our website, unclaimedfunds.ohio.gov, to search for your name, the name of a family member, or a loved one to see if you have an unclaimed fund.
So today we're talking about impairment, and I'm in a conversation with enforcement attorney Patrick Haggerty, where he's walking me through a specific case that came before the board. So Dr. Z's impairment was addressed by the board, and then he relapsed. So in the hearing, Dr. Z talks about making his practice focused on house calls. Is that something you'd seen before? this case?
No, I had not seen house calls. So I've been working for the board for about going on 5 years now. That was the first house call case I'd seen. This particular doctor, his patient base was more homebound type of situations. Not necessarily like hospice, but just people that could not function outside their home, so and didn't have transportation to go to a doctor's office or things of that nature.
Dr. Z was also writing prescriptions for patients without their knowledge and then was picking them up for his own consumption. This is a crime, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, it's a felony.
And as I understand it, that's really how local law enforcement got involved, huh?
Yes. So essentially, this doctor was basically writing prescriptions in other people's names. Essentially, what they did was they took the patient's names that he was writing the prescriptions for and then going and picking them up, kind of did a general search on their other medical history and found that this particular doctor had no previous, I guess, treatment of these patients. So they really raised a lot of red flags. And so, then they essentially got search warrants for his vehicle and his house. And they executed those search warrants simultaneously. Basically pulled Dr. Z over in his car under the auspices of a traffic stop, but then basically, got him out of the car, gave him the warrant, and then searched his car. But then again, contemporaneously at the same time, his house was being searched. They found 112 hydrocodone pills in a bag, and then another prescription bottle full of hydrocodone in a patient's name, not his name, not Dr. Z's name. I do not know the outcome of the criminal case.
Even if he was not actually convicted of a crime, which it sounds like it would be a little hard to believe that did not happen, the board does not need a conviction in order to take action in a case like this. Is that right?
No, they do not. So since he had not been found guilty, had not pled or been adjudicated guilty by a court or jury or anything like that, we basically cited him under acts constituting a felony.
One of the things I noticed when I was reading through the R&R, the report and recommendation from the hearing, was that Dr. Z admitted to be struggling with financial and professional difficulties, as well as the illness of a loved one. And so I'm curious, how common is it to see substance abuse given these kinds of factors? Is that something that we see with these kind of cases often?
So I mean, essentially, this would be a relapse. So he'd been under treatment, and you see a lot of cases where there's like a relapse, basically somebody going back to the drug of choice or a new drug or whatever, because of outside stressors. Life can be stressful, and he had a lot of stress. So, and he did not, I guess, lean on his support system to not go back to those addictive pills and things like that he was taking. So I mean, in the R&R, he says, I didn't follow my steps, I didn't do what I should have. But what I think is interesting is, in his testimony, he says, I was relieved when I got pulled over and this is finally over. Well, you could have, the board does have a mechanism to help people if they are, if they've relapsed, if they've gone back to those, getting back on drugs, or, going back to using alcohol or whatever it may be, to help practitioners deal with that issue sooner than later. And this particular doctor apparently had been back on the hydrocodone for about 2 years before all this finally came to a head.
I really, honestly, this case kind of made me sad when I read through details, because it did sound like a kind of a combination of factors that, I don't know, it could have turned out differently, is the way I see it. had there been? You talked about not relying on a support system, not going back to the things that he knew, were going to help him get through. There was a particular occurrence that happened that really escalated this issue in the case. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So essentially, they pull him over. They find all the pills. We find out about the criminal charges. Well, then our investigator goes out and talks to him. He admits to the writing prescriptions and things of that nature, but then that was it. So then our investigator does a little more digging and finds that another complaint had been filed by the family of a patient that he was doing these house calls, claiming that this particular doctor had taken 20 hydrocodone pills from the patient's prescription bottle. And so when our investigator went out to do a follow-up, and initially the doctor denied that he did this, but then he admitted, okay, yeah, I did it. And then on top of that, said, well, I might have actually done this with other patients too. Well, then at hearing, he then kind of retracts that admission and basically says, well, no, I didn't take any pills, or I don't really remember taking any pills. And the investigator was pressuring me to say this and things like that. But then he finally says, okay, yeah, I did take the pills from the second patient, but then retracts his other admission, saying that there may have been up to 5 other patients that he did this to. So that definitely exacerbated all of this.
I see. And again, that was because he was doing these house calls. So he was given access basically to his patients' houses and was then stealing medications. I think I read even he didn't think that someone was going to notice the 20 pills that he took. Yeah,
he was trying to do like just enough pills to feed his addiction, but not to get caught. And the thing is, the family from the previous house call that he made noticed that he was fidgeting with his pockets a lot. And so when they got a call from him saying, hey, I need to come and do a pill count, which already raised a red flag for them already, they made sure to count the pills and get a good count. And then as soon as he was gone, they recounted them and found that there was 20 pills missing.
I can't imagine what I would think or feel if I realized that was happening. Good for them for paying attention. It's interesting to me in this case that Dr. Z actually self-reported many of the details. Is that something that the board considers when they're making a decision?
But the thing is, though, he didn't report this stuff until he actually got pulled over and the search warrants were executed by law enforcement. So that kind of goes back to my previous point about this, is that had he reported all of this relapse even a week prior, and sought the board's help in trying to deal with this relapse and this addiction that had reared its ugly head again, the board probably would have looked a lot more favorably on that self-report, but really he only reported it because he got caught. And so while it is a mitigating factor, it's not like this, I guess, this huge silver lining that you can look at, because again, the only reason he reported it is because he got caught and he knew, okay, I better report this now as opposed to waiting and then the board will find out about it at some point.
Okay. That is disappointing then. What did the board decide to do? When it was all said and done, again, we talked about in the past, the process goes to hearing. The hearing examiner writes a report and recommendation, which is basically the recommendation to the board based on all the evidence gathered, precedent, and saying this is what we think should happen to this licensee. What did the board decide?
Oh, they permanently revoked this doctor's license. And I can tell you that I do remember, even though it's been 2 years, I do remember one of the issues that they really looked at was the fact that the doctor went into somebody's patient's houses and took their prescriptions. Podiatrists, physicians, our licensees in general, because the licensees we I guess the board oversees do have people in vulnerable positions, whatever those licensees may be. I mean, a massage therapist, your client is there half naked, under a little sheet, they're in a vulnerable position. A doctor, you're examining a patient and they're in a vulnerable position. Podiatrist, especially in this situation where we're talking about homebound patients, these are patients that are in a vulnerable position. Um, you know, uh, they took that to heart, that, a licensee who is trusted by their patients violated that trust pretty egregiously, and then tried to like backtrack on it, in some way. So yeah, I would say that was probably, at least how I remember the board meeting, especially if a couple of the board members really honing in on that particular aspect of this whole thing.
We'll be right back after this short break.
The Ohio Department of Taxation is launching the next phase of our new online tax system, OH Tax e-Services. Starting December 9th, 2024, 6 new tax types will be added, including sales and use, employer and school district withholding, public utility personal property, public utility excise, natural gas, and the new adult use cannabis tax. OH Tax is a free online service that makes managing your taxes simple. With just a few clicks, you can file returns, make payments, and track your status from your computer or mobile device. We've also added live chat support, so you can get real-time help from our tax agents whenever you need it. At the Ohio Department of Taxation, we're focused on creating a seamless experience for all of our taxpayers. Register today at tax.ohio.gov/OH-tax. Again, that's tax.ohio.gov/OH-tax to discover what OH Tax can do for you.
Welcome back. Today we're talking to enforcement attorney Patrick Haggerty about impairment and how it affects providers, but also how the board identifies it when it becomes a problem. This case may sound like we caught the bad guy, but in reality, a board action like this is necessary but sad. What is the overarching goal of the board for a matter of this nature?
I'm sure this has been said many a time, but again, the main reason for the board, the main purpose for this board is to protect the public. We do have a duty to be fair to our licensees, but the main goal is to protect the public. So the overarching, I guess, goal out of this is to make sure that the public is protected from practitioners that not only are impaired, but then that don't have, I guess, for lack of a better term, impulse control or control over their behavior because of their addiction, for i.e. going into patients' homes and taking their pills. So yeah, that, and given the fact that there's a previous history, had this been the first time, there's I would say, slight possibility that this doctor would still have a license. But again, the fact that he went into patients' homes and took their pills, I think really, 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 really exacerbated the board's feeling about what to do with this particular licensee.
Absolutely. And I can imagine, I've heard the board members discuss cases like this. I don't recall this one, this idea of trust being violated, and you can't get that back. It's really hard to, I should say, get that back once it's violated. So I don't think they take too kindly.
No. Yes, I would definitely say when any licensee violates, a client or patient's trust, and that really does, they take that to heart a lot if that's the situation.
So again, we've talked about a lot of things with today's case. Someone who had a past of impairment, specifically with substance abuse, had been treated, had, potentially, right, we thought maybe, been rehabilitated, got the help they needed, and then ended up relapsing and just really slid down a slippery slope into not just poor behavior, but like damaging behavior, things that were dangerous to the patients and unethical. What can listeners learn from a case like this, in your opinion?
So I would say that the understanding of addiction, at least as far as the way the statutes have been written for the medical board. I can't speak for any other administrative agency, but the way that the statutes have been written have undergone a lot of change, and the changes in the way that they've been written we're trying to catch up to how the science of addiction is evolving. So we are trying to write the laws to not only be more understanding about the issues and the science and disease of addiction, but we're also trying to do so to help the licensees maintain their practice, maintain their ability to provide for their family, but also with that understanding, that underlying idea that, the board is here to protect the public.
I imagine, especially when we're dealing with impairment concerns, and we have someone who's basically either fraudulently like writing prescriptions or writing them for someone and picking them up, or I think even the consent agreement covered, I think he was writing them for family members and asking those people to share medications, like all kind of issues with prescribing. I imagine we sometimes then are teaming up with other entities like the DEA or the Board of Pharmacy. Is that the case?
Yeah. So there's definitely been multiple times that I've been here that I've been in contact with county prosecutors, DEA, FBI, DOJ, Department of Justice, and local law enforcement, pharmacy board. Absolutely have dealt with them.
I think it's important to note as well, when looking at a case like this, there again, a lot of factors involved. Just because someone has an impairment issue, it does not mean they're automatically going to lose their license. The good thing is that the board does have resources available to those kind of providers, but they can get the help they need. Doesn't mean they get to practice while that's happening, but they may still be able to continue to practice. Coming to mind right now, we have this video that was recorded several years back, actually, it was a person who was getting off probation who had been granted a license. And he basically was telling his story to the medical students in the audience at his final board appearance. And he was explaining how when he was a resident, he had developed a drinking problem, but he thought that if he kept it separate, like if he was still performing well academically and clinically, then it wasn't going to be an issue. And I'll never forget one of the things he said, which is he knew how to be the physician in that dynamic. And he had referred many patients out to get, help for those kind of issues. But he kind of saw himself outside of that process. And he ended up getting involved with a professional health program in the state that he was holding his training certificate in. And he said just how interesting and eye-opening it was to be in a room with other practitioners like him. Because it made him not the other. It made him understand that this is something that, yes, he was dealing with, but he wasn't by himself. And at the end of the day, he really appreciated the process, not necessarily, having the impairment issue, but the process that he had to go through to make sure that he could be healthy and that he could take care of his patients in the end. And something that we show medical students all the time, that the board ended up granting him a license in the state. They put him on probation to make sure that he was okay. It did not bar him from getting a license in the state because he was forthcoming about it and because he was under control of the situation and, had the resources he needed to do well and succeed. Patrick, what is your favorite part about your job here at the medical board?
I mean, this is a new area of law for me. So I've been in practice for a little over 20 years now. As I said, I've been with the board for about 5 years, but before this, I was in private practice. I was a solo practitioner in multiple areas of law that did not have to do with administrative law. I find it very stimulating to get into a whole nother area of law. Sometimes there are success stories, in situations like this. Also, I do find it rewarding when you get some really bad practitioners, whatever they may be, and you're able to get them out of practice. And again, that idea that we're protecting the public. So, I do find it rewarding that, like, oh, there is a bad guy that really does need to be taken out of practice. Now, again, the worst thing we can do is take somebody's license. We can't arrest anybody. We don't have that power. We can refer people to law enforcement, but again, it does, those times when we actually do get the bad guy and get them out of practice, that's a rewarding feeling too.
I know from being here at the medical board, we've been here close to about the same time. Been here about 5.5 years. There's never a boring day at the medical board.
No, there is not. There's always something.
Always something. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Patrick. I really appreciate it. The purpose of this podcast is to serve as an educational tool for listeners. We want you to be well-informed and equipped to ask the right questions of your providers. I think it's also important to make clear that we share these cases as cautionary tales. Every person represented here is real and experienced real consequences. I'd like to be particularly clear that impairment of all kinds is not something to be laughed at or taken lightly. If you suspect a provider you know is struggling with mental, physical, or chemical impairment, please file a complaint today so that the board can refer them to an expert for assessment. If you or someone you know is struggling with this issue, please reach out for help. There are so many resources available to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of MedBoard Pulse from a state medical board. Special thanks to our guest, Patrick Haggerty, enforcement attorney for the medical board. We appreciate you helping to uncover the details of this case. Subscribe today to hear our episodes right away. For more information about the medical board, email med.ohio.gov. You can also email questions or comments at communications@med.ohio.gov. And remember, the more you listen, the more you'll learn, the more you'll share.